Hi, welcome back. So I wanted to talk about something I found inside the Controlled Defensive Behavior report that I've quoted in some of my other material. It says, space in this report does not permit a discussion of psychotronic generators, devices which are reported to be able to store human bioplasmatic forces for later use. I want you to think about that because that sounds kind of Ghostbusters, right? So think about it in terms of, what we've discussed in previous material about how trauma signatures, things about fear and death and things like that can be sort of bottled and contained into an energy that's sort of like an ether. This kind of demonstrates that our military back in, as of 1972, was investigating this phenomenon and were familiar with research that the Russians had already done on it, or what was then the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. So they were concerned about what they needed to do to compete with that. So since that was 1972, this year as of this report is 2018, I think that's relevant. But I'm going to quote from two materials here. One is called, the one I just mentioned, Controlled Defensive Behavior. I'll put in the comment section below the document numbers. You can go to the Freedom of Information Act library on CIA.gov and download them yourself. That one's written by John D LaMothe, and the other one I'm going to be quoting from is called The Gateway Experience, Brain Hemisphere Synchronization in Perspective by Wayne McDonnell, and that one's from 1963. So we're talking well over 50 years ago that some of this material was put out. So getting to it, so I wanted to talk about how that relates to, first of all, transcendental meditation. He talks about as like, an interaction with the gray matter in the brain as a real science. So they even have some diagrams here that I can show you. It says that, on the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted, single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted to the gray matter in the cerebral cortex. So you think about what that process involves, right? You're actually kind of talking about like sort of like what that Wilhelm Reich diagram with the energy spheres going into the body and then recirculating. How that process it involves like your glandular, your glands inside the center of your body, and there's all pairs of these things going up and down your body, and it all goes right up to the center of your brain where you have the pineal gland in the center. And there isn't a pair of pineal glands, you only have the one, even though you have hemispheres of a brain. So clearly there's something about how that interaction goes involving transcendental meditation, the pineal gland, and how that relates to biocommunications, or rather how human beings interact with other human beings and using energetic signatures and ELF. And on to that, part 9 of the report says brain stimulation. Bentov's biomedical model shows that this resonance is of considerable importance since it is directly transmitted to and impacts upon the brain. The resulting vibration is received and transmitted into the brain itself via the fluid-filled third and left ventricles located above the brainstem. An electromagnetic pulse is then generated which stimulates the brain to raise the amplitude and frequency of brain wave output. Just as Dr. Twemlow observed in his research on the effects of the hemisync tapes, also, the brain is contained in a tight membrane called the dura, which is in turn cushioned by a thin layer of fluid located between it and the skull. As the coherent resonance produced by the human heart in a state of profound relaxation reaches the fluid layer surrounding the brain, it sets up a rhythmic pattern in which the brain moves up and down approximately 0.005 to 0.010 millimeters in a continuous pattern. The self-reinforcing character of resonant behavior accounts for the body's ability to sustain this movement despite the minimal level of energy involved. In this way, the entire body, based on its own micromotion, functions as a tuned vibrational system which transfers energy in a range of between 6.8 and 7.5 hertz and into the Earth's ionospheric cavity, which itself resonates at about 7 to 7.5 hertz. And if you remember from my other material, a hertz is one cycle per second. Of this process, Bentov states, this is occurring at a very long wavelength of about 40,000 kilometers, or just about the perimeter of this planet. In other words, a signal from the movement of the bodies will travel around the world in about 1/7 of a second through the electrostatic field in which we are embedded. Such a long wavelength knows no obstacles, and its strength does not attenuate much over large distances. Naturally, it will go through just about anything, metal, concrete, water, and the fields making up our bodies. It is the ideal medium for conveying a telepathic signal. So that's the science of telepathy. That's the science of the way we have a biochemical interaction in our brain that can actually send out a signal that's measurable and it can be received by another operator receiver, right? Which is another human being in this case. Energy entrainment. As the body is turned into a coherent oscillator vibrating in harmony with the surrounding electrostatic medium, the specific exercises, including the gateway tapes, enjoin the participant to build up the energy field surrounding his body, presumably by using energy from the Earth's field, which the body is now entraining because of its ability to resonate with it. This puts the body's energy field into homogeneity with its surrounding environment and promotes movement of the seat of consciousness into the surrounding environment, partly in response to the fact that the two electromagnetic medians are now a single energy continuum. Thus, the same process which moves the brain into focused coherence at steadily higher levels of frequency and amplitude, so as to entrain analogous frequencies in the universe for data collection, also promotes enhancement of bodily energy levels to a point adequate to permit the subject to experience an out-of-body movement when he is ready to do so. More will be said about this topic later. In addition, by resonating with the Earth's electromagnetic sphere, the human body creates a surprisingly powerful carrier wave to assist the mind in communication activity with another human mind similarly tuned. Okay, so I think what this is really communicating is, when you talk about how you're at a similar frequency in that, roughly 7 hertz range there, and how your brain is operating at a very similar range, by going into alpha states, you're able to sort of mimic that same frequency that the Earth resonates at, see? And so it's sort of a skill to develop that's very valuable to be able to achieve alpha state in that way. And when you do that, basically, by connecting to that Earth energy grid that's at a similar frequency, you'll also find other people that are capable of tapping into that frequency at the same hertz level that are able to communicate with you at that bioplasmatic level. So there's sort of an energy transfer that occurs. And that's pretty interesting because, these hertz level waves, they can travel across anything. They don't experience attenuation. They go through everything. And they can travel clear across the globe. And depending on how you perceive things, if we're in an ionosphere and everything's sort of like trapped within this ionosphere, then everything's just sort of contained within that and bouncing around in a way. Or it just continues to move on, and outward. So it's something to ponder and think about a little bit. But then the next part here says conscious energy. Before our explanation can proceed any further, it is essential to define the mechanism by which the human mind exercises the function known as consciousness, and describe the way in which that consciousness operates to deduce meaning from the stimuli which it receives. To do this, we will first consider the fundamental character of the material world in which we have our physical existence in order to accurately perceive the raw stuff with which our consciousness must work. The first point which needs to be made is that the two terms, matter and energy, tend to be misleading if taken to indicate two distinctly different states of existence in the physical world that we know it. Indeed, if the term matter is taken to mean a solid substance as opposed to energy, which is understood to mean a force of some sort, then the use of the former is entirely misleading. Science now knows that both the electrons which spin in the energy field located around the nucleus of the atom and the nucleus itself are made up of nothing more than oscillating energy grids. Solid matter, in the strict construction of the term, simply does not exist. So you can read through all the numbers there on this. It's pretty interesting. The point to be made is that the entire human being, brain, consciousness, and all, is like the universe which surrounds him, nothing more or less than an extraordinarily complex system of energy fields. The so-called states of matter are actually variances in the state of energy, and human consciousness is a function of the interaction of energy in two opposite states, motion versus rest, in a manner described. So you think about that. It's states of energy in human consciousness as a function of the interaction of energy in two opposite states. That kind of feeds into the whole orgone matrix that Wilhelm Reich discussed involving positive orgone radiation and deadly orgone radiation, or what would be considered to be dormant, right? More still or static. Think about through. POR would almost be considered motion, and DOR might be considered rest when you're thinking about this in terms of Wilhelm Reich's research. So I think it's worth investigating a little bit further based on that premise too, especially since you have math and numbers associated with this in this document. So moving on, it says, one of the purposes of this report is to evaluate research in the field of influencing human behavior in order that the U.S. may be in the position to develop certain countermeasures. So that's part of what was driving the whole writing of the Controlled Offensive Behavior report, and I've covered that in some of my other articles, as I mentioned before. But what I thought was interesting about this part of the report in particular was that it says an increase in body temperature decreases the body water level and creates a saltwater imbalance. With a large intake of water but little replacement of sodium chloride, painful spasms of the skeletal and abdominal muscles may develop, as may also faintness, weakness, nausea, and vomiting. So this is what happens with non-ionizing radiation, the type that would be considered weaponized electronic warfare methodologies. They have the effect of basically heating up or changing your body temperature. That was a reference to decreasing, but it can also increase your body temperature as well. So it says that it is believed that the use of temperature manipulation as a technique to influence human behavior is practical. In order to be effective, it would seem necessary to apply this technique to individuals or small groups that are already under one's influence, such as prisoners of war. The application of unnatural temperature in field situations appear to be most difficult. So wow, yeah. And then they talk about the manipulation of atmospheric conditions, which I think is very relevant to Wilhelm Reich's research as well, since we're talking about that. It says there has been some work reported on the physiological or psychological effects of atmospheric or geophysical parameters. The works referenced here are free world, but there is little doubt that the Soviet Union has investigated similar effects, especially in relation to their space program. The utilization of any of the techniques to alter human behavior by changing atmospheric conditions seems remote for field application. These techniques, like temperature effects, are more suitable for controlled groups or individuals. So that's pretty interesting, right? Because we're talking about bioenergetic weapons, how bioplasma might be feeding into something that is deliverable, right? So it says intermittent exposures to negatively ionized air produces a sedating effect on humans. There are some researchers who believe that the positively ionized air causes irritation and anxiety, which is applicable to altering behavior. So again, the weaponizing of ionized air even, This is why we need to be more educated about electronic warfare methods, because, you could have people that are serving a more domestic terrorist function that are getting away with a lot of things because they use methods that are very difficult to detect, but have a very strong effect on human behavior and human physiology. It can cause diseases. It says they also use odors. I don't want to get too deep into this, but they just talk about how odors, if the smell is foul or irritating enough, a man will attempt to avoid it. If escape is hindered or if the odors are used with surprise, they may elicit certain behavioral changes in the individual. So you see a lot of these people that are doing these types of activities sometimes involving, energetic manipulation, oftentimes are integrating, chemicals that have a certain odor to them, and that's an observation I've had as well. Light, so now you're getting into more of the MK Ultra, light flicker and pulsing. But see, what I think is more interesting about their observations on light, and I'll let you read these here on your own for the most part, but you can kind of see how they're discussing the difference between yellow light and non-rhythmic bright lights, and how these different effects can change your sleep, and thinking through about how we've had these sort of clean energy methodologies and LED and different types of bulbs and everything like that integrated in that are now less of a constant light and more of a pulsed light, more of a off-on type function in order to save energy. And so what they're discussing here is almost like, before we had those things as quote-unquote, clean energy things, they were being used more as methods to control behavior in human subjects, which would be consistent with things that are about like MK Ultra and things that are similar to that. Sound. So you've probably seen some news lately about sound being used like ultrasonic weapons. Like in Cuba, for example, at an embassy, there's reports of that about a year or two ago. It says sound from one source or another has been used to elicit behavioral changes in every war ever recorded. So, if it says it could have been a simple bugle call or a battle cry or a mechanical siren device, right? So it was something very simple back then, but of course nowadays they're upping the ante. Now this report was written in 1972, so it said back then, they said exposure to a siren generated sound of 20 kilohertz at 1 watt per square centimeter kills a variety of insect life in 3 to 4 minutes, and larger animals, mice, in about 1 minute. That's a sound wave. That's a sound weapon. Human operators with earplugs experience cool, sizzling sensations in the mouth and an unpleasant tingling in the nasal passages when they hear the siren. And I've experienced things that are similar to this as well, so I can validate that that's a real thing. Sound can be used on controlled groups or in the field. Sound can produce behavioral changes, and the effects of sound on humans is being investigated. So again, I think that's been well researched and discussed already, so I won't get into too much information there. But and also, I've already talked about some of this information in my other reports. So I'm not going to get too deep into it. But since they do mention electromagnetic energy specifically in the super high frequency range, it's notable that within the same document and everything else I just mentioned, they're also talking specifically about SHF, super high frequency, and that's defined as anything between 3 gigahertz to, I think 30 gigahertz. And I'll put a document up here showing that. And that would include things like some of the Wi-Fi that you use, so standards and things like that. So that's why that's relevant. And then, getting later into the gateway process documents and things like that, they discuss bioenergetics and biocommunication in more depth. So I wanted to talk about this one in more depth, that we have some more clear, I guess, ways of communicating certain terms. So it talks about bioinformation is defined as those phenomenon associated with the obtaining of information through means other than normal sensory channels through extrasensory perception. There are several forms of ESP, including A, telepathy, transmission or reading of thoughts refers to the extrasensory reception of information about the mental processes of others. B, proscopy or precognition. While the above forms appear to differ only in the nature of the object about which information is received, numerous observations indicate that precognitive ESP involves, under certain circumstances, trespassing the barrier of time to obtain information about future events. Paragnosia or clairvoyance refers to the extrasensory reception of information about objective events in the outer world. I think that's pretty relevant too, especially since Science Applications International Corporation called their program PAIR for short, PEAR, Princeton Engineering Anomalous Research, PAIR. So it might have been a code for paragnosia. Bioenergetics. Those phenomenon associated with the production of objectively detectable effects through means other than the known energetic influences. Seemingly incredible effects have been reported, such as the movement of distant objects without any detectable use of physical force, telekinesis, anti-gravitational effects, transformations of energy, electromagnetic effects arising without adequate physical cause, and chemical reactions in biological processes occurring through mental concentration, or like PK. So I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, so I don't want to read through every single part of this report, but I'm going to leave some slides up here for you to go through. You can freeze frame it and read some of the rest of this report. But, I just wanted to get back to Kirlian photography a little bit, because during the Cold War era, they were very, very interested in this topic, and it's sort of like aura photography. So taking a picture of your aura field or your bioenergetic field, your bioplasmatic field. Okay, so I'm just going to read this from the Defense Intelligence Agency report. As mentioned above, the Soviets seem preoccupied with the search for the energy that carries or facilitates telepathy transmission. Is it electromagnetic or not? The search for this unknown energy has led the Soviets to Kirlian photography, named after its inventors, Semyon and Valentina Kirlian. The Kirlians developed a technique of photographing with a high-frequency electrical field involving a specially constructed high-frequency spark generator, tuned up and down between 75,000 to 200,000 electrical oscillations per second. Their first photographs showed turquoise and reddish-yellow patterns of flares coming out of specific channels within the leaves. A magnified picture of a finger showed craters of light and flares. By the 1960s, research on bioluminescence revealed by Kirlian photography was going on in many Soviet universities. Perfected techniques of photographing the play of high-frequency currents on humans, plants, and animals, as well as on inanimate matter, have set the Soviets on some striking discoveries about the energetic nature of man. Bioplasma is a term coined by the Soviets for bioluminescent phenomenon or energy. Scientists at the Kazakh State University at Alma-Ata have found that the illnesses tend to show up in advance as a disordered play of flares from the bioplasma long before they manifest in the physical body. According to Ostrander and Schroeder, the Soviets may be attempting to link Kirlian photography with computers, among other things, to instantly analyze the spectra of colors appearing in the varied colored flares from the living body. It is believed if there is any positive basis for Kirlian photography in bioplasma body of humans, the Soviets may be closer than is thought on the controlled use of the Apport techniques and the possible astral projection phenomenon. Let's think about that. I don't want to get into astral projection right now, but you should do some research on that. It says they found that by charting acupuncture points, a correlation exists between bioplasma and changes on the surface of the sun. At the exact moment solar flares occur, there are changes in the electrical potential of the skin's acupuncture points. These electrical charges are measured by a toboscope, probably a simple Wheatstone bridge device. In some way, the bioplasma of the body is sensitive to these solar explosions, the instant they occur, even though it takes about 2 days for the cosmic particles to reach the Earth. The most significant use of Kirlian photography is in the area of psychokinesis over mind over matter, PK. And so I don't want to read the entire thing, but basically, if you can pause it and read it if you want to, but while they had somebody who was gifted at psychokinesis, they could move objects through thoughts, and that they noticed that that their eyes during the apparent movement of objects by PK would be luminescent. There would be bioplasma that would come out from their eyes. And I mean, talk about that. That's pretty trippy. It said in one test, a raw egg was placed in a salt solution inside a sealed aquarium 6 feet away from somebody with PK potential. Researchers report that she was able to use PK to separate the yolk from the white of the egg. See, so by using thoughts, you can actually change the temperature of something or somebody. So there's something to psychokinesis and the ability to actually affect behavior, because if you think about it, it's a non-ionizing radiation that you're emitting, right? Because you're emitting an actual frequency. And that means that behavior, especially a person that's very strongly psychokinetic, has an effect on the people around them. They're literally creating a waveform that will actually hit that person that's in the near field of it within a certain range. They can actually affect them at a behavioral level. It's demonstrated it because non-ionizing radiation actually heats things up. In converse, if you're attracted to somebody, for example, one of the reasons why your pulse might increase is because of that attraction. And again, that's a frequency thing. That person's emitting a frequency, and then you're attracted to them, and then your temperature goes up. It's a non-ionizing effect, and it's a waveform that's doing it when you really get down to the science of it. There's other parts of it too, right? It's your heart rate and everything else, but think about it. So I thought that was interesting. It says that in electromagnetic fields, they went all around her body and all begin to pulse in rhythm whenever she's experiencing something PK. There's research topics. So Soviet researchers postulate that it was these rhythmic vibrations that cause objects to be attracted or repelled to her. So people that are strongly intuitive, people that have PK ability, people that are gifted within, they have a tendency to be able to emit waveforms that literally can create vibrations in the people around them. So, I'd say that if you have abilities too, then you almost have a higher social responsibility to be a nicer person. Honestly, I mean, this has really made me aware of a lot of things that I wasn't aware of before. So to close things up here, I just want to get back to the original point that I was making, that psychotronic generators, devices which are reported to be able to store human bioplasmatic forces for later use, have been developed. Okay, so getting back to the Ghostbusters thing, within human energy, and I've talked about this in my other articles, they're using sort of like this process, it seems, that they learned through Wilhelm Reich's experiments with cloud busting. It seems to translate over to the human condition, where you can pulse a human target with very similar frequencies to generate this same spectrum of DOR and POR ether, which is really just bioplasma. And so when you think about that, if you can do that to a human, and you can do that within cloud busting, then really a psychotronic generator that has been reported to be able to store human bioplasmic forces, that was designed back in 1972, imagine where we are today with it. So it's something to think about and something to really take seriously. So I'd encourage you to go into some of my other material, like The Wizard of Hertz, where I discuss how some of these technologies are using like megahertz type frequencies and those types of interactions to actually generate some of these behavioral and potentially bioplasmic, extraction methodologies. So I think that's worth discussing. But anyways, I want to close this up because I know I've been going on for a while here. So I just want to keep this to mostly raw data, and I will leave all the document numbers for you to find everything here yourself. And thank you.